disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
A boss ain't nothing but a thief on a time loan. 128-bit war, you play Nintendo. On some shooter, so put the bridge down. Don't feed us to the killer bees. We get what we deserve. Like bury me with my MP3s. Write my manifesto in 72 DPI. Life's just a game. You got cheated, never learn. I write these songs for every bridge that ain't been burned. For every cop car that ain't been turned.
I'm Angela Kaufman. I'm a resident of the Saratoga Lakeview Mobile Home Park. We're a small park in the town of Saratoga, New York.
Okay, so walk us through what's going on. You're running into some difficulties, so tell us what's happening.
Sure. So I'm a new member of this community. I moved into the mobile home park in the summer of 2020, hoping to have a sustainable way to live as a self-employed person with numerous health issues and as the sole source of income for my household. And we were led to believe that this would be a place we could call home for a good long time. 5 months after we moved in, my neighbors and I received a notice in the mail that the park was being sold to a developer named Mike Giovanone, and that he intended to change the use of the park. So where we are in New York State, that activates a protective law that gives us as the residents a right of first refusal. And we were in the process of exercising that right and trying to collectively purchase the park so we could preserve our homes. Mike Giovanone and the previous landlord found out about that, and they changed their sales contract to basically state that they would give us 5 years, that the owner would not change the use of the park right away. So we allegedly were going to get a 5-year reprieve, but we were also going to lose our right of first refusal. And since Mike Giovanone became the new owner back in June of this year, he appears to have gone to and continue to go to great lengths to make life unbearable here. And it appears that he is doing this in hopes of driving us out so he can use the land to expand his heated luxury boat storage business.
What happened next? How did you start to push back against that? And what happened?
So even before the closing, I was starting to push back because, we were getting help at the time from a nonprofit, but I felt like, no one's going to fight for your rights the way you are. Like, the liberation of the working class is for the workers. Like the protection of our homes is for the people who live there. We're going to fight harder than anybody else. So I started to go to the media openly. And then I found out after the fact, after an article had gone out with my name on it, criticizing this situation, I met the new landlord, Mike Giovanone, when he was touring the park, and that's how I found out that the closing went through. He's the new landlord. I went outside my home with my phone recording video. I followed him around, and he tried to intimidate me by saying, oh, do you have a permit for that roof? And made some other snarky comments. And he asked me if I had any questions for him. And literally the whole time, all I said to him is, I want to know why at 66 years old, you have nothing better to do than to make us all homeless. An hour later, the sheriff was at my door, and the burden of proof was on me to prove that I did not threaten his well-being because he called the police and said that I threatened him. So ever since then, we don't leave the house without body cameras. He's called the police on me several times. He's removed almost all of the trees from the park. My neighbors are uncomfortably hot in the winter. They've said that their food is melting in their cabinets because it's so hot. It's now flooding every time it rains a little bit. And one of my neighbors has actually indicated to me that she just couldn't deal with it anymore, and she's left the park as of the end of October. She indicated that she's going to be couch surfing now, but that she just couldn't deal with the what has been described as harassment and aggressive intimidation. He's repeatedly vilified me and scared my neighbors away from collaborating with me. And recently he had me arrested for trying to delay the recent round of tree cutting because I was challenging that based on a town code stating that mobile home parks are required to provide for residents an adequate amount of trees to provide shade and to block unsightly views or something to that effect.
And explain to listeners the significance of him coming in as the new owner and what that entails and the power that he has to basically change everyone's life for the worst and raise rents if he wants to.
Oh yeah, he did that too. He did an illegal rent raise. But yes, thank you. So one of the things people don't always realize about mobile home parks, people are like, oh, why don't you just move? Like if it's an apartment, like your new landlord, why don't you just move? Well, the thing is, if you live in an apartment and that building gets sold and your new landlord gives you a hard time and you move, it's still a hassle, but you're packing up a couple of rooms worth of stuff. When you live in a mobile home park, you own your home, but you don't own the land. So you are at the whims of the landlord, who may change the rules, change the rent, make your life miserable. And in spite of the name, most mobile homes are actually not movable. So in my park, there's maybe one or two that are movable. And even then it costs thousands of dollars, like between $8,000, $10,000, sometimes more to move the home. And then you've got to move it to a new park where you have to apply to live there and on and on. So it's not quite so easy. And what's happening is, people from a business perspective are recognizing that when you own a mobile home park, whether you're a private owner, or a corporate owner, you basically have a captive community of tenants. It's very much like a feudal system, because on the one hand, we residents get an affordable way to own a home and hopefully just have a decent, sustainable life. But when someone decides to exploit that, it becomes a nightmare because you put your life savings into a home and suddenly you risk losing it. And there's actually mobile home park owners who, if they drive out a tenant or evict a tenant, and the tenant can't move their home, the owner then just absorbs the ownership of that home and then rents it or sells it and continues to profit on the fact that they've just taken away somebody's, life's worth of work and savings.
Yeah, and there's no legal protections like there are for homeowners or people renting. It's kind of the worst of both worlds because you own your house, so you're responsible if the roof leaks or something like that. But at the same time, you're paying to basically exist on a small strip of land, so you're still paying rent essentially, and you have to abide by all these rules. But if a new owner comes in, or if the old owner decides to, they can jack up the price as much as they want to. I think I don't know how it is over there, but generally they just have to basically give a certain day's notice that they're raising the rent. I mean, most people go through rent increases if they're renting, but the difference is they could raise it exponentially by hundreds of dollars. Right. And the goal doing that seems like what you're going through is they're trying to kick everybody out because they want to basically gentrify the area, or they're going to sell the land, which is, we talked to some folks in Kentucky a couple months back, and that's basically what they were going through, is they were being all kicked out and they were just going to build a strip mall on top of it.
And it's funny you say that, because I remember reading about that and hearing about that. And they were, one of the articles I read, they were referencing other states that have better mobile home protection laws. And the sad thing is, New York State has one of the best mobile home protection legislation. But again, in a classist system, these laws are worthless. So as of 2019, our new laws cap rent increases unless a landlord can provide certain kind of justification. So like if they put in a pool, they can raise your rent more than 3%. If they plow your snow, they can't use that as a justification because they're supposed to do that anyway, if that's the agreement. And it's also supposed to have this right of first refusal. But as we can see in our case, for a while, things seemed kind of hopeful because we were told oh, don't worry, the Attorney General is involved. They're very interested. They're going to make sure there's no retaliation. But this is like a perfect case of okay, it's great. Even when there are protections, it's great to have something on paper, but all it is words on paper because our rent was illegally raised, and the state is aware of it. And they confirmed to me in the beginning of October that they were aware of it. And I email them just about every week saying, okay, so what's the plan to get our rent reimbursed? Because we were supposed to get a 90-day warning and we didn't. So in this situation, it's also unique because it really brings out the classism. Like if someone had a home with a foundation, and they were, being stolen from basically, or being subjected to this illegal behavior, I can guarantee they would not be treated the way that my neighbors and I and people in communities around this country are treated. So I think some of the reason that we don't have a lot of protections and the reason that our protections end up being worthless is because of classism.
Yeah, and what's sad is that, a lot of people, really the most vulnerable, like people that are living on a fixed income, they're dealing with like some sort of medical issue or something like that, or they're elderly, they're
right.
just really susceptible to just their lives falling apart if they don't have this like one lifeline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this, the sad thing is this should be the ideal situation for somebody in that type of, I have neighbors who are elderly, who are disabled, who are, low-income people with kids. Last year, we were all essential workers. Yay, clap your hands. Now we're housing, insecure. And this should be the perfect situation for people. But the sad thing is, that the park owners have so much power. They just, they can just exploit people. And I've canvassed, since this situation, I became more interested in canvassing other parks to, find out what's going on and make sure people know their rights. And I've talked to people who have said, like, there's horrible things happening in this park, but we don't want to say anything because we literally can't afford to live anywhere else. People who paid off their home when they were working and now they're retired or they're on disability. And this is like really all they can afford. It's all I can afford. I have neighbors here who, they don't know what they're going to do next, because the rents here are incredible. And of course, with this past year, the housing market has just completely ballooned out of control. And I don't know where people with kids, are going to go, or people with families are going to go after this. But the boats will have heated storage units, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, you said before we started recording, you said that there was a protest so far with the local IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, and also some other things in the mix. Tell us about that.
Sure. So I continue to organize, and my neighbors have been so intimidated that they're not willing or able to, which I understand, and I don't fault them for. But I am a member of the James Connolly branch of the IWW, which is our Upstate branch. I'm connected with other groups locally that have taken an interest in this situation, and so it actually has been a bit of a lifesaver, because things were feeling really hopeless for a couple of months when I felt like I was doing this all, like fighting back all by myself. But then when I started connecting with other groups and realizing that, yes, this is an intersectional struggle, even like we have had a lot going on with our local Saratoga Black Lives Matter. I mean, they have been put through some horrible things in the past year. And yet they're also helping. Like, they showed up and spoke at this protest. So this protest was in early October. I did not advertise it openly because of things that have gone on. For example, my landlord appeared to have tried to sabotage a visit from an organizer trying to canvass in our community. The manager called him. He showed up right away. He came over and was acting very aggressive and unprofessional. So I didn't advertise this openly, but still there was a fair number of people in attendance. They learned about the situation. They learned about how housing injustice overlaps with environmental injustice and racism and classism and all of that. And we did a little march. I have been arrested recently, so my court date is December 7th, and I'm planning to have a protest then as well. And there's, groups like the area, the Albany GDC, the IWW. I've had support from folks from Extinction Rebellion locally. So that's really been huge. It's really been helpful. And I think to some extent, I think it's also a little bit of a relief to my neighbors to see that, like, people are watching, and I've gone to the media several times, and just today there was this great article that came out, and I feel like the more my neighbors see this response from the larger community, the more they realize we are not alone. Because one thing I've noticed is this landlord appears to try old school union busting tactics, to try to make us feel like we're alone and have no support. And it's just, just like an abuser, just like an abusive relationship. And the more people see that, like, no, there are people who don't even live here who care about this issue. I think it's helping to counter some of the feelings of being demoralized that we were left with when our attempts to preserve our community were basically undermined.
Well, thanks for sharing your story. I mean, best of luck to you. Is there a way that people can kind of follow this?
Sure. There's actually a Facebook page called Save Saratoga Lakeview Mobile Home Park. And an anonymous administrator set that up for us. And so we're posting updates on there, and people can get in touch with me and reach out if they have any questions, or even if they're going through a similar thing and just want to connect and get ideas.
Great. Yeah, we'll make sure to link that in the show notes. Anything else you want to say?
I just really appreciate you having me on the show and helping to elevate what's going on here.
I've been running the show, black and young and bleeding slow. Paid the price for my ancient war. Faces in when the merry-go comes around and snatch your soul. Black and young and unemployed, only pain, no sense of joy. Beast of violence is a baby boy. Papa died with them fucked up lungs. Mama died with them broken bones. Working hard to keep the lights on. I hope this is the right song. I wrestle with my thoughts. This is a life we ain't cut for. In this dungeon, we must plunge it. Consequence of a racist project. I'ma die with 100 times. Massacred like Marigan. Take a slide like a Michael Brown. Cold blood on the muddy ground. Cold blood on the muddy ground. I'ma die for 100 times. Massacred like Marigan. Take a slide like Michael Brown. Cold blood on the muddy ground. Yes, blood on the muddy ground. Sound of the South. Check ça. Prêt à déchirer les chaînes. Prêt à encaisser les peines. Poussé par la rage et la haine. On va tout faire pour changer ces systèmes. On s'arrête pas, on enchaîne. Aucune matraque nous freine. CRS back, c'est les mêmes. Tous des hyènes qui protègent ce système. Pour armer, pour nous intimider. Le capitalisme n'a pas d'intégrité. Basé sur l'injustice et l'indignité. On va l'enterrer, y a pas d'infinité. Les heures sont comptées. On va l'enterrer, y a pas d'infinité. On va le démonter. Il va s'enterrer, y a pas d'infinité. Break loose from your chains. Use your mind cause you can't. No rest, no rest. No rest for the unfree. No rest, no rest. No rest for the unfree. Break loose from your chains. Break loose from your chains. Use your mind cause you can't. No rest, no rest. No rest for the unfree. More stress for the unfree. Break loose from the chains. Break loose from the chains. Use your mind cause you can't. No rest for the unfree. No rest for the unfree. No rest.
Okay, once again, we're back for another week. We have a special guest with us this week, Marcela from Feel the News. And if you haven't watched it yet, one of us went on Feel the News, which is a show that you can watch on YouTube. It's also a live comedy performance. Do you just want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so Feel the News is a comedy show. It started off as a TikTok. I say it's a humor news with a sense of humor and anarchy because I make jokes and I say the state sucks. So yeah, there's a Feel the News plus Friends on YouTube where I invite like friends to talk about the news, and then it's also on TikTok where I do like little short news summaries where I hopefully tell you sad news and you cry, but then I have jokes which make you feel a little better. So it's Feel the News with Marcela on TikTok and then Feel the News on YouTube.
Awesome. Yeah, check it out. Support the Patreon. Watch the show. It's great stuff. And thanks so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about, there's just like a series of trials right now that are going on that I'm sure most people listening to this are aware of. There's the Charlottesville trial, where the organizers of the neo-Nazi rally Unite the Right are on trial. There is currently also the Kyle Rittenhouse trial in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and also in the Atlanta, Georgia area, there's the Ahmaud Arbery trial, where 3 of his killers are on trial right now. There's also some other stuff going on. I know, for instance, like the so-called QAnon shaman just recently got sentenced. We were talking before we started recording about how he actually got less time than Daniel Baker, the anarchist and former YPG volunteer, got for calling for people online to engage in protest against far-right people like the QAnon shaman. Just to get us started, let's first turn to Charlottesville. It's just been kind of a strange circus in the courtroom. Christopher Cantwell is obsessed with it's going down, and Unicorn Riot. It's very strange. I mean, like, there was a couple articles that came out about Cantwell, but like in his first kind of opening statements, he dropped racial slurs and talked about Mein Kampf and just like all of this like really obscene stuff, and he just seems to be lapping it up and thinking he's like making himself out to be this really awesome person. It just seems really strange.
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of this that's kind of become really interesting is a number of things. I mean, the first is, Cantwell and Richard Spencer are trying to sort of represent themselves. And, we've talked about this on the show before, but like Richard Spencer, though a, complete piece of human garbage, actually is kind of intelligent. And so he's actually mounting like a somewhat coherent defense. It's not a good one, but it's coherent. Cantwell, on the other hand, who is not a particularly articulate human being, is getting legal advice from Bill White and Matthew Hale. So for those of you that don't know who those are, Bill White used to be the head of the National Socialist Movement in the mid-2000s, around the time of the Toledo riots, so like 2005. He is in prison for, during a trial he had, I forget what the charges even were, he put a hit out on the federal judge that was overseeing the trial. And of course, the person who took the hit was an FBI agent, so he's in prison for like ever. Matthew Hale, on the other hand, is a person who is associated with like Tom Metzger and White Aryan Resistance. He's in prison for, I think, murder, I want to say. But
actually, I think you're getting him reversed. It's easy to do that with the white nationalists, but Matthew,
they're the same. It's like the same guy.
Matthew Hale is the guy that created the creativity movement, where it's
That's
like
what it is.
all white men are God, but apparently God didn't know that he was working with an FBI agent to try to kill a judge. So, and he's in jail now.
God has blind spots. It happens.
He has blind spots, apparently.
So Matt Hale is a lawyer in the sense that he went to law school and passed the bar exam, but no bar will accept him, so he couldn't represent Cantwell. So these guys are like advising him, and his defense still is, look at me, I'm racist and a really good artist, and IGD is the leader of Antifa, and so therefore my defense. And so it's just kind of like devolved into this weird circus with Chris Cantwell, and that's just kind of the first entertaining part of the Charlottesville trial, to be honest.
I just think, I will say this, I'm always fascinated by like how white men just have this confidence to think that they could do stuff and then get away with it, and then they're literally surprised when people are like, no, you can't do that, because like they're just so used to getting away with things. And like what's fascinating with me about these two jerks is like they're literally trying to gaslight everybody into believing that like, oh no, we didn't actually go there to cause trouble, when there's like proof that they did that. And just like the imagination and the confidence for you to think that you can gaslight like not just like a jury but like the rest of this country. Very impressed.
What I find fascinating is if you read through like the transcripts that Unicorn Riot has done like meticulously, one thing I see happening again and again is two things. The first is that their constant defense, no matter who's on the stand, seems to be like when they're presented with, hey, you said like you're the exterminator and you're here to kill all the Jews. Like, how do you respond to that? Their defense is that, oh, it's just a troll. Like everyone across the board has said that. Like Heimbach, Spencer, Elliot Klein or Eli Mosley, like they've all tried to use that defense. Like, oh, like we're just edgy jokesters. Like Richard Spencer tried to equate it to like heavy metal people. But if you listen to these people or read what they said, they talk about this stuff and they're pretty open about it. And I thought that was some of the best testimony I felt was when Samantha, who's used to date one of the Identity Europa people, and she dropped out. But she was saying, like, no, I mean, like, they're serious. Like, they talk about this stuff. It's not a troll. Like, that's their defense mechanism, is to call it a troll, to, like, obscure it to the rest of the world.
I was going to say, there's also this dynamic in which we're learning a little bit about their internal dynamics at the same time that they are also learning about their internal dynamics, because none of these people know each other. I mean, we talked a lot about this when we've talked about why the alt-right was able to be sort of gone after and unwound in the way that it was. And it really comes down to the fact that there's no actual cohesion or trust here. And so these people didn't really know each other at the time. They probably know each other a lot better now, but we've learned some things. For example, Jason Kessler this whole time thought that people respected him. But in the chat logs that have been released at the trial, there's all these side chats where they're like, oh man, we're going to make this guy Kessler take the fall for this whole thing. We're going to like put his name on the permits and everything. It's going to be so funny. Ha ha ha. And he's sitting in the courtroom with these people. Samantha, when she was giving her testimony, pretty openly talked about how everyone cheats on everyone else's significant others with each other. They didn't know that. She specifically said that she had cheated on Eli Mosley with Richard Spencer. They were sitting 2 chairs down from each other. And he didn't know that and found it out in the middle of the trial. It's been a little tense on the sort of defendant's table just a little bit. And you're starting to see like the cracks I think some of us knew were there going really public as a result of this. It's one of kind of the fascinating side stories that isn't really being super covered a lot in the press because of everything else.
So the cuck is coming from inside the ethno-state.
And also, nothing like a group chat to totally destroy whatever relationships y'all have. Like, you know, if it's like a separate group chat and you're like, ooh, we didn't actually like you. But like, the thing that I don't like about this whole trolling thing is like, because people think that comedy is like, you can be, it's like being mean, like that's funny. And it's like, I blame all the comedians out there for this type of, because it's like, you say, oh, we were only kidding. Saying that you're gonna like kill people, that's not, even if you're saying you're trolling, that's still not okay. Like, you know?
Yeah. Well, and they hid behind this for years. I mean, like the classic case of this is Weave, right? So for those of you that don't know, Weave is currently the systems administrator for Daily Stormer. As far as we know, he's in Russia or Serbia. That's what he claims, and evidence from pictures that he's posted confirm that. But he used to be a person who was loosely associated with Anonymous and was actually considered a political prisoner when he went to prison for reporting a vulnerability to Apple and then getting locked up for it, and was supported by left-wing people in Anonymous for a long time because for years and years and years, he had been super, super, super racist, right? Like he was part of a trolling crew that would like deface websites with swastikas and stuff. And whenever people would confront him about it, he'd be like, I'm just trolling. He comes out of prison with a giant swastika tattoo on his chest. And
is he trolling himself then with a like that?
He comes out and does a press conference and says, I am a white supremacist. He was not trolling the entire time. It was a cover. And you would think that was years ago. You would think that people would have picked up on that by now. It's kind of shocking that even in the press, they're even talking about that part of it. That there's still people that weren't convinced that this was just a cover or something. You'd have to be really not paying attention to not have understood this by this point.
But I also do think that it's just like this other part of America that just doesn't want to accept the fact that white people like these like are racist and they want to be racist and they enjoy it. You know what I mean? Because I do think that does pull the veil from the fact that we do live in like a racial hierarchy where these people, because I mean like if like I went around saying, ooh, I want to kill white, like no one would, you know, and I'd be like, hey, just kidding. No one would be like, oh no, they're actually just kidding. You know what I mean?
There's even examples of like black organizers saying certain things about like, you know, look at this police officer that just died, lol. And then that's suddenly justification for an investigation or their house getting raided or something like that. I mean, you know, across the board, there's many examples like that. Whereas like you can find whole Facebook chat logs full of like patriots and Proud Boys and white nationalists saying like, hey, we're going to go kill Ted Wheeler. And apparently that's not cause for some sort of investigation just because, like you said, it's a bunch of like middle of the road MAGA supporting far-right people. In the case of the Charlottesville folks, I mean, again, like, all you have to do is listen to their podcast. I mean, like, Richard Spencer has done stuff with, Augustus Invictus, who is not even at the trial, but one of the defendants, talking about how they want to create, a worldwide, white hegemony, as they call it. I mean, Heimbach has talked about how they need to kill all the Jews, and even one bagel stand left standing is too much. I mean, like, they're very clear about their ideology and, like, the violence they want to engage in.
Yeah. Also, the whole white hegemony thing, too late, dude, it's been done. It's here! Like, what? Like, you're, like, so behind. Catch up. It's already happening.
Yeah, well, and what that tells me a bit, and this is probably the more disturbing part, if we look at history with these court cases, so like this court case has a lot of allusions to cases that the Southern Poverty Law Center filed in the 90s, in the Anti-Defamation League, where they would go after organizations like the Aryan Nation after, say, an attack where someone would get killed or a synagogue would get attacked or something like that. The lawsuit would be against the organization. It's sort of like a civil RICO case, roughly, right? And they were able to seize land and assets of these groups and stuff like that. But again, to make that happen, people died. Synagogues got burned down, stuff got bombed before any court took any of that seriously. And so it concerns me on a level in which there's this kind of discourse around the Charlottesville trial in the media where people are starting to say things like, well, look, yeah, we're starting to like really come to terms with how awful the right wing is, and all of this is going public, and isn't that great? It's going to solve all the problems. But the thing is if this trial were not in Charlottesville, if this were about any other white supremacist attack, no one would be paying any attention to it. No one would care. The fact of the matter is it was in Charlottesville and someone died there, and that's the only reason why this trial is even getting any attention whatsoever. Like, that is a huge, massive problem. People should be paying attention to this stuff, and it takes tragedy before they do often.
Well, and it was a white lady too that was killed, and that was really terrible and sad. But like, I can imagine if it wasn't, I don't know if people would be talking about this.
Unfortunately, there's like examples of that. There was a 66-year-old gentleman.
Please stop proving me right. Please stop. I don't want it anymore.
Well, there was a gentleman in New York that like a alt-right supporter, I believe it was like in March or April or something in the spring of 2017, literally went to Brooklyn with a sword.
Oh, yes.
And he murdered an African American man. He was 66. Literally with a sword, killed him with a sword, and he was, automatically arrested, and he, went to prison. But I mean, he followed Richard Spencer and all these people. There was another incident where I think it was at a college campus where another like alt-right person murdered a younger African American man, that was just out of like the army program. I think he was about ready to go into like, law school or something like that. And like both of those incidents, like they hit the news obviously, but they were not this like cataclysmic thing like Charlottesville, where the eyes of the nation turned because, of course, it was a white person killing a black person. And that's just not out of the ordinary in America.
Oh my God, that is really upsetting. But is it okay if I like read this one quote? Because I really, I think it like, it's like this book, As Black as Resistance, we're just talking about it. It's by Zoe Samudzi. And it's like, whenever there's a dominant system that enables or privileges certain groups over others, violence against those considered lesser is increasingly justified by that system, especially against those defying that system. White supremacy has dehumanized black people to such an extent that killing a black person is not only widely socially acceptable, but also a necessary function of anti-black subjugation. So it's like, these Nazis in Charlottesville, I do think that a lot of the reason why, this is an issue is because they did harm white people, right? And it's the same thing with Kyle, right? It's problematic it's really problematic, but what I guess what scares me the most about both of these cases is that whatever way if they do go, I guess what people think would be positively, it's just like a state flex to say, oh, see, we're not racist. We did something, right?
Right.
And it doesn't prevent the actual work that needs to be done, which is like, we need to like, dismantle a system that like prioritizes white people over other people, right? And this is why white people are misbehaving. It's like, if you're in a school or you're a kid and you're never like, the teacher never punishes you and you can just mess things up, why would you ever stop? Like, I'm gonna mess up like the coloring, throw things around. It's like, oh, it's fine. Johnny didn't mean it. He's just sad, like it's, yeah.
No, it expresses itself. And we talk a lot about this on the show. There's this kind of tempo, which happens. And I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I've seen this tempo exist in this cycle for just as long. But Essentially what happens is that something really tragic like Charlottesville happens. And then all of these like white liberal types go, oh my God, there's fascists and they're dangerous. And we should listen to all those kids in the black hoodies that we said were like petulant children that we should never we should have listened to them the whole time. And then 6 months go by and everyone forgets. And then January 6th happens and everyone goes, oh crap, there's Nazis? Man, we should have really listened to those kids in the black hoodies that we told were like petulant children. You know, like we should have really been paying attention. And this happens like every 6 months. And it's just like, the problem is that unless you have decided as a white person in America to intentionally engage as an anti-fascist, you have no reason to ever know what's going on in that world. Ever. Because it doesn't touch you. Right?
And also, like, these are like your uncles and your cousins. You're like, he's just funny. He just makes jokes. He doesn't really mean it. Uncle Tom, you know how he is. He's not really going to go to DC. And then you're like, holy, he's there now.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they don't know what to do. And what you've been seeing, I think, this whole time, this kind of like push towards civil war amongst the right wing, this discussion of secessionism, all of these kind of like rising memes in which the right wing is kind of like putting forward this sort of authoritarian understanding of murdering their opponents. All of that is a reaction to what I would consider to be a very moderate challenge to white supremacy in the United States.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. It's like a tiny bit. It's like, it's not okay to just like, it's not okay to like be openly racist. Oh no, that's not okay. Like, I like that part of America. It's like they're fighting for America, which America, as we know, is like a settler like state that is racist. And when they say they're fighting for America, they actually are. Like, to be honest, they are.
Well, this is where I think radical liberals like rad lib types have a really hard time, because on one hand, they want to sound really radical, especially after last summer. You know, they're like, yeah, we want to really talk about like police brutality. We want to really talk about like prisons and stuff. And you'll even see like liberals like say things that sound vaguely radical, right? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, what they're constantly doing in that context of resistance is they're constantly moderating that resistance. They're trying to pull it back within the state. They're trying to say, we don't need to actually go out and abolish the police by driving them out of our neighborhoods. What we need to do is we need to make that a budget issue. We need to bring it inside the budget process and defund them slowly over the course of 25 years and hope that everything works out and that the state just abolishes itself. It's an absurd argument, right? But it's an argument that you can have when these things don't directly impact you. Right?
Exactly. They don't have skin in the game. Like, they don't. Like, you're not being harassed.
Yeah, and the first time they was last summer.
And they were like, abolish the police. I saw that tweet. I laughed so hard. Some black person was like, yeah, white people dealt with the police for one day, and they were like, abolish the police. Like, yeah, we've been saying this forever.
For real.
I mean, they're not saying abolish the police, of course, but Tucker Carlson's new, like, pseudo InfoWarsy documentary about January 6th is basically like, you know, the authoritarian communist Biden state is coming after the right wing, labeling all of us white supremacists, which is funny because the person that made the film that he worked with, like, works on, like, white power documentaries, so
it's a literal white supremacist.
Yeah, and they're like, there's no white supremacists here.
Like, all irony's lost on them. They don't get it.
But, I mean, now they finally have their, like, pretext of, like, the state's coming down on us because we tried to, I don't know, stop the election.
Well, and this happened in the 90s, too. I mean, like, the entire mythos of the right wing in the United States today is the sort of expansion and scaling up of where militia types were at 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And for them, they were reacting to Ruby Ridge. And they were like, what do you mean you can decide to not just go to court and get a bunch of guns and stay on the top of a mountain? What do you mean the cops are going to come and get you? And they were just like so outraged that would happen. And like, granted, a lot of really horrible stuff happened at Ruby Ridge that probably shouldn't have. However, the fact of the matter is that was one standoff at a period of time in a decade immediately after the Philadelphia police bombed an entire city block. There were multiple other standoffs in left-wing communities, and cops have been murdering black folks at an increasing rate for 2 decades.
They also made, like, for instance, with Waco, white supremacists made a concerted effort to brand that as an attack on white people. And, like, I brought this up before, but I think one of the most fascinating things about Waco is that there was a banner that the Branch Davidians dropped before the raid where a lot of them were killed. and it said, "Rodney King, we understand."
Yeah.
Basically they were saying, like, you know, we get it. We get what black people are going through in this country because we're finally getting a taste of it at our front door. But of course, what the far right and the white nationalists did is they said, no, this is all about basically the state coming against, you know, white people, and it's about guns and God.
Mm-hmm. White people want to be oppressed so bad. I swear to God. It's like a constant struggle. It's like, no, like...
Well, I wanted to say one other thing about Charlottesville, and then we can move on to the other trials we're talking about. But
yeah, sure.
I think one of the other things that's fascinating about, like, the whole kind of like conspiracy theory that Cantwell is building, and I think this is the other scary thing that we see with the Charlottesville trial, is that this has grown exponentially since Charlottesville itself, but just this buildup of like conspiracy theories about, you know, quote, Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And like, they're really trying to feed off of it. And I think that's their only kernel that they can kind of like hold on to. It's constant, like, kind of trying to create conspiracy theories of social movements, especially from people that like are used to just kind of like, a discombobulated network of talking heads that are on podcasts and trying to like lead these little fiefdoms of neo-Nazis. Like, to them, an actual movement looks like a conspiracy. You know, a preacher giving a sermon about why people should resist neo-Nazis, mentioning an anarchist website, of course, seems like a conspiracy theory if you're not actually involved in an active social movement where these different pieces are working together and talking to each other and people are organizing and coming out and meeting each other. That seems to be really the only thing they can offer to the MAGA folks that are probably sitting on the jury, is just like, hey, you don't like Black Lives Matter, we don't like Black Lives Matter. You don't like Antifa, we don't like Antifa. Like,
we're on the same side.
It's also a way to explain away a clear paradox that exists in white supremacist thought. And this paradox goes back to the Nazis, right? But essentially, they have to simultaneously claim that they are the most powerful people in the world and entirely oppressed by everybody else all the time.
I know. It's like, how do you do this? How do you dice that? But what I think is like super interesting that you did bring up is like the fact that they're not organized, so they think that organization is conspiracy. It's like, I don't get how y'all do it. I don't see how you're organized. This is something, you're doing something. It's like, no, we just talk to each other, okay? And we don't say mean things about other people in group chats. And if we do, we try to make sure that other people don't find out. Like, there's like, I don't get how y'all are doing that. So that must be a totally like, you know what I mean? If you can't do something and somebody else is doing, it's like, something's going on over there. It's fishy and I don't like it. But it is.
And this happened at the moment where they felt the strongest, right? Like, Charlottesville was supposed to be their sort of coming forward as a movement, and it destroyed them. But they were sort of at the height of their strength at that point before the decline. And so for them, it's, you know, I was talking to a friend about this yesterday. Cause they were like, how can they square that circle? Right?
How did we fail? We're white, we're smart, and we have guns.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And like have money and like wealthy backers, right? People like Peter Brimlow are super wealthy. And so, essentially it comes down to something really simple, I think, which is that they have this narrative in which they are incredibly powerful. And what they can't come to terms with is the fact that they got completely rolled by a network of people, which is like, to them, a bunch of scrawny vegan kids, right? In like black hoodies. Yeah,
and that's why they get mad. I've also noticed they get mad now when they found out like that lefties are not actually anti-gun. They're like, what? That's how y'all hate guns. I was like, no, we actually are okay with guns. We actually think we should have guns. And we're like, no.
That's where like the conspiracy stuff comes in too, because it's like, you know, Heimbach and Spencer will say this all the time, like, Antifa is a bunch of like heroin addicts or something like that, which is funny because, I mean, I guess they don't care about all the white people that are addicted to opioids. But I know,
it's a crisis.
But it, you know, like, so on one hand, it's like these like lowly crust punk heroin addicts, but then on the other hand, it's like, oh, they're all, you know, pawns of the all-powerful Jews. It's just like that classic like far-right archetype of like, they live under rocks and like will try to grab your daughter, and then they also run the world and the media. Yeah. It's like they're everything and everything.
Yes. Also so uncreative to say that Jews run the world and run the media. It's just like anti-Semitic and uncreative. Like, you've been saying the same messed up, wrong thing forever. It's like, come on. Racism is so uncreative. It really is. It's like,
let's turn now. There's also the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, which probably by the time you listen to this will probably be decided. It's going to be telling to see what happens. Also, there's the Ahmaud Arbery trial happening in Georgia. And both of these trials are marked by the fact that in the Arbery trial, I believe there's only one African American on the jury. And in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, according to Newsweek, there's only one, quote, person of color. So I guess my question that I would open up with is, and this is something that's even been commented on by the judge of the Rittenhouse trial, just like kind of throwing up their hands saying like, yeah, we know that the racial makeup of this trial is screwed, but it is what it is. So obviously there's such a history in America of trials being stacked like this in order to have a certain outcome. What does this say about America in 2021 that we're still seeing juries like this?
Well, I mean, I think what it says is that white people do have shared commonalities in the sense of like they'll always side with each other, right? Like, why would you assume that just because somebody's white, they're going to side with Rittenhouse, right? And why would you assume that just because somebody's black, they're not, right? It's like this whole, it's like everybody knows that we live in a racial hierarchy and we all pretend like we don't, but we all know, wink, 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 wink. It's not really true, but for some reason, we always assume that white people are going to do certain things, aka they're always going to side with white people, even if they're racist. But no, we don't live in a racial hierarchy, right? Like, I think that's what it is. It's like America tries to act like we're enlightened and we're better, but it's like, but we also know that we're messed up. You know, it's like this dichotomy of like pretense that is very frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it cuts to the core of, you know, something we've been arguing on this show for, well, pretty much as long as the show's existed, which is that there's no solving this problem without coming to terms with America itself, right? Mm-hmm. This is a, you know, colonial project. There's no way to extricate anything that happens here from that history. In the same way that you couldn't extricate the apartheid regime from, you know, Belgian colonialism in South Africa. It's similar here. And so, what happens often in the U.S. is that we have this like complicated relationship with American history in which on one hand, there's an increasing recognition that there's deep-seated problems in American history, right? To put it very lightly. But on the other hand, there's still this weird adherence to at least the traces of the sense in which America is this place of freedom and we can solve our problems. And until that mentality is gone beyond, until we can get past the idea that just because we get to choose our dictators as opposed to just having them imposed on us, that somehow that means that we can solve like core fundamental structural problems without, you know, destroying the structure itself. Until we can get past that, none of this is ever going to change. It fundamentally requires, you know, to use the term revolutionary abolitionist movement, burning down the American plantation, like literally. There's no other way to move past that. Until that happens, until that reckoning occurs, we're just going to see the same pattern repeat itself over and over and over and over again. Sometimes with increasing levels of criticism and sometimes not.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is also, I think that when we say that accept that America is what it is, I think that Black people and like other people of color have an understanding of things, right? I think what we're really talking about is like why people have to come to terms that this country was created for them by them, right? And what that means is that in order for them to live here, and I think white people have an understanding of like what, when people say white privilege, they know what that means. It's not just material gains, but it's hierarchical gains, right? So when we're talking about how the law treats you differently, how you treat, actually how institutions treat you, it's different. And they know that. That's why white people get so upset. Like, I want a manager, like, when they don't get a certain type of treatment. Cause, like, they know what they're supposed to be getting, right? It's just for white people to accept, like, yeah, this system is built for me. And that means that it can't be fixed. You know what I mean? Something that they already inherently know. And I think you ask any white person who's ever been treated badly, I've never been treated so badly in my life. They know why they're saying that, right? Cause it's for other people, not for them, right?
Yeah, well, and isn't that what's at the core of both of these trials, right? So, like, what are we looking at? We're looking at these cases in which there's white gunmen who initiated conflicts claiming self-defense, which really implies, it's specifically in the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, specifically implies his sense that he was entitled to be there to begin with in Kenosha, which is a place he's not from, in a state he doesn't live in a conflict that he had nothing to do with. And yet somehow he feels entitled to just position himself in the middle of it, claim space within that, and then claim that he felt threatened because other people happen to be in that space. I mean, the level of arrogance it takes to make that claim is just astounding. Like, absolutely astounding. It's like almost impossible to really think on a sort of generic level, right? How highly educated people like judges and lawyers and stuff could in any way find any sort of validity to that. But then again, once you insert the racial history of the United States, all of that starts to make sense really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a couple of things I wanted to bring up about the Rittenhouse thing, and this is stuff that we've already gone over before. But, you know, again, like on This Is America, we were able to interview somebody that lived in Kenosha, and they talked about how the day before the shooting, that the town on social media was flooded with far-right conspiracy theories that Black Lives Matter was going to go into the wealthy neighborhoods of Kenosha, which I don't know if you've seen photos of Kenosha, but it doesn't look like there are very many wealthy areas, or if there were, it was kind of far away from where most of the rioting happening. But of course, everyone was going to go where the rich white people lived and like storm their palaces and steal their toasters, because that's of course what everybody wants.
Toaster. I want a good toaster.
One of those ones with 4 slices at the same time?
I mean, life-changing if you haven't had it.
That's our recurring joke, is that, of course, you know, when people are looting from, you know, bourgeois corporate stores, they're like, if only we could go to somebody's, you know, house and like just take their everyday crap that they've already used. I mean, that would be so much better, you know.
I'm like going to
I just want to kill white people so much that, you know, I want to stop getting these Apple products and go to Timmy's house.
But, like, you know what? I would like to say this. Doesn't that show you that white people have an understanding that they have more stuff than other people because you're white? Just the fact that they're constantly afraid. Who is afraid of people taking their stuff if they know that they don't have stuff that other people don't have, right? Like, so, like, I grew up in Kenya, and, like, wealthy people have, like, these large, like, they have these gates right on these walls. Why? Because they know that the people outside don't have that stuff, and they're scared because they know that they don't actually, it's like deep down inside, you know, you don't deserve that. Like, you're like, I know, like, you know, so it's like this whole idea, it's like just the idea that like they feel like people are coming for their stuff is that they know that they have more stuff, you know, like it's just like, I don't know, sorry to interrupt, but it's just like, that always gets me, cause it's like, you know what's up.
Well, this is a point both Idris Robinson makes, and it's also a point that's made in defense of looting, but we really look back at property discourse in the United States and the way that is attached to concepts of the human. There's a very obvious connection between the, you know, sort of centrality of property in white communities and slavery. That a lot of, you know, like the discourse of W.E.B. Du Bois, right, like in Black Reconstruction, talks about how, slavery didn't end because of the Civil War. Slavery ended because black folks escaped slavery and murdered their plantation owners, right?
Well,
and ultimately ended slavery that way. But so what was the argument though at the time? Like the argument in the South was, but if you help slaves escape, you're stealing my property, right? And we need to arm ourselves because people are coming to steal our property. And like that sort of idea of imposing scarcity is something that's core to capitalism, right? It's how commodities have value. But the idea that can be sort of attached to a community and then defended against a different community, that's really where it falls into the core of American racism.
Well, yeah, and even the idea of property, like, does come, like, I think it's like David Graeber's, like, Death the First 5,000 Years, he talks about how, like, the idea of, like, property does come from, like, slavery, like, the ownership of another person, right? Like, for you to have, like, just, like, the law of it, like, the legal terms of, like, property and owning something is tied to, like, slavery. Which, I mean, like, does that make sense? But one thing that I did want to mention is, like, I was reading A People's History of the United States of America, and before, you know when, like, the American Revolution, put that in quotes, wasn't, a lot of poor people were just angry at wealthy people, right? Like, before, like, the revolution, they were looting wealthy people's houses, like, taking their things, drinking their wine, and they sort of, you know what I mean? Like, that's often been, like, people who have power know that at the end of the day, that's what they're scared of the most, is that the people who they're exploiting are going to, like, come for their stuff. You know?
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin.
Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show.
There's actually a really interesting historical conversation happening right now about like the American Revolution and talking about like where black people fought on what side. And a lot of people fought against the American Revolution because they were fighting for the British side, because the British side was going towards abolition quicker, and they thought if we fight against, and this is something Gerald Horne has written a lot about.
Yeah,
they're thinking like, well, if we fight against the American project, we'll be able to hasten the collapse of the transatlantic slave trade. I don't know, it's fascinating too. I mean, but yeah, that's kind of like what a lot of historians have argued, is that people saw the American project kind of as a way to get ahead of those different class and anti-colonial antagonisms and basically create and solidify an American state that included slavery very firmly within it.
Yeah, exactly. And like this whole the wealthy people in the United States actually turned peasants, but poor people who were actually just angry about just like wealth disparity, turned them against the crown, right? White people specifically, right? Because white people, before the propaganda, it wasn't really about, ooh, I want to be free, because it's like, what? Like, you're not really paying taxes. Like, they were just angry that they were poor, and they were going after wealthy white people. And that was just like so fascinating to read that, because it's like something that's not really spoken of. I mean, obviously I've always known that the American Revolution can't truly be a revolution. How can you claim to want freedom while you're enslaving others? That doesn't even make any sense. Like, just imagine like them sitting together, it's like, guys, we want freedom. And it's like, well, what about like, the people who are not free? Yeah, we're not going to talk about that, right?
Right. Yeah. Also, just like, Bacon's Rebellion, like, centers so much in this. And this is, that was like 100 years or so before the American Revolution, but they just got so freaked out that, indentured servants, which were what we would now call white, and enslaved Africans, were teaming up. And there's other examples of that. I mean, we actually did a whole podcast on kind of like the whole Free State of Jones thing that they made a film about. But yeah, basically out of that, then they developed all these racial codes and laws, which was a combination of carrots and sticks of, white people can do this, white people can't do that. You get certain privileges if you basically go along with the racial program, but also, if you intermarry or help these people or, help them escape, then we'll put you in chains as well, like all that stuff. And then, lo and behold, fast forward a couple hundred years later, and you've got this system of, racial hierarchy and caste, which we know today. And that's what's so funny about, to me, like the discussion around, quote unquote, critical race theory. It's like all this stuff, like, even predates the American project. And like, you don't even want to talk about it. Like, no. I don't know. I mean, if you taught kids about the real history of America from when they're children, they'll be like, burn it down. Like, immediately. Like, it was like, so they created blackness so that poor white people and black people wouldn't come together to like fight, for their freedom and like right to be treated fairly. They'd be like, because even like Christopher Columbus, I don't know, I grew up in Texas, so I don't know what I learned, but the way that we learned about Christopher Columbus was like, oh, he was just a guy and, he just did stuff. Why don't they want to teach people the truth? Because they know it's bad. You tell a lie because you know the truth is so bad. And like, they don't want to turn their kids against like them, essentially.
I was one of those kids that was raised by parents who were like, all these things you're learning in history class are not right. And look at me now. I'm helping host this podcast. So like, there we go. Just like, proof of this theory, like I definitely know a number of other people like this too. And it's one of these like moments in which, I think for a lot of like older millennials, this came from reading Chomsky, right? Specifically because that was really available and that was like radical stuff in the early 2000s. And so a lot of people read it. Were like, oh my God, what do you mean that the U.S. dropped napalm on Vietnamese villages for 10 years? That's like terrible. Oh, and they get like scandalized by it, right?
Yeah. And even recent history, like I talk a lot about Barack Obama on my set. And all I literally say is that, I don't like Barack Obama. And that joke always bombs, but not as much as Obama bombed the Middle East. And and it's just like, listen, this is recent history. We can't even talk about that. Like, we can't even come to terms with that.
Let me ask, everybody this. We're getting close to the end here. I think a lot of people have asked, like, how do we have a wider conversation with the rest of society, our families, friends, coworkers, so on and so forth, about these trials? Is the end kind of discussion like, look, this is America at work. This is what we get. This is what it produces.
There's this thing that people who research the conflict in the Balkans say a lot, which is if you go there and you ask someone a simple question about what's going on, grab a cup of coffee and prepare for a lecture about the last 500 years of history. That's actually what we need to do, right? The reality is if we look at these things in the bubble from the contemporary moment, it's really easy to fall into the trap of accepting the exceptions, find the simple explanations, right? But really, with the Rittenhouse trial and with the trial in Georgia around Ahmaud Arbery, very specifically, what we are looking at is we are looking at white people who deputize themselves as vigilantes. Mm-hmm. And this calls back really heavily to the history of policing in America, right? Like, there's a lot of people that want to say, oh, that's an exception to policing. We should let real cops do this. Those people are vigilantes, blah, blah, blah. But everyone seems to want to forget that police departments themselves grew out of slave patrols, which were vigilantes, grew out of things like Pinkerton guards, which were hired vigilantes, right? And the entire time, the structure of policing was fundamentally tied to things like posses, the KKK, things like this, which are all vigilantes. And they were all there to, deal with concepts of white threat, right? Or things that white people felt were threatening, namely everybody that wasn't white. And so when we see things like stand your ground laws and self-defense laws being weaponized in the way that we're watching happen in these trials right now, that's not an anomaly. That is actually the standard trajectory of American history, right? And we need to be able to talk about all of that. We need to be able to say, these guys who killed Ahmaud Arbery because they saw a black man jogging through their neighborhood, they're actually expressing something which has happened literally thousands of times in America. And that forms the power structure of the South, right? This is not an aberration. This is actually normality. And if you're horrified by that, you should be horrified by the normality, not horrified by this narrative that it's an exception to that.
No, yeah, like you said, I would say, largely the same thing, except I'd be like, it's literally comes down to, yes, it's because of slavery, right? Like, so, it's just like, I hate to like simplify things like that, but I will say this to people in terms of like, however these trials go, whether, Rittenhouse is found guilty, whether, those two jerks in Charlottesville have to pay out money for being bad people, or whether, these, the triple threat of evil, is found guilty for killing Ahmaud. At the end of the day, that doesn't change the fact that we are abolitionists, so we cannot support prison. We cannot support putting people in prison, because at the end of the day, the people who it comes to bite in the ass the most is us, right? When I say us, I mean Black people specifically, right? And in addition to that, I would also say that in the spirit of being abolitionist, abolitionism is not just about abolishing prisons. It's about creating a society that does not need prisons, right? And so what does that mean? That means we have to dismantle the racial hierarchy. So even if Kyle Rittenhouse is found guilty and he's gone to prison, like obviously we cannot have abolition now. In order to prevent something like that from happening ever again, it's not to put somebody in prison. It's to create a society where something like that does not happen. And what does that mean? That means dismantling a racial hierarchy that says, ooh, if a white person does something, it's okay because you're white. And like, that's okay because in America, if you're a Black person, you already know this. If you're a Black person, you're immediately considered to be a criminal, regardless of what you've done. Your body is criminalized, right? If you're a white person, you're always right? And that's why when white people are caught in things and they have to face the consequences, so-called consequences, they're like, oh, no, of course not. That would never happen to me because I'm white and I do everything good, right? So I guess those are the two main points that I would like, if you're talking to your family, however way this goes, is if it goes the way you want it to be, we should not support people being put in prison, because at the end of the day, in order for us to live in the world where these things don't happen, prison is not the solution. The solution is to dismantle a racial hierarchy that causes people to do the things that they do. And whatever, with like Chauvin, it was like a show like, oh, America's not racist. America's racist. It doesn't matter what happens. So that's another thing. It's still racist. Doesn't matter what happens. So yeah, we're abolitionists. We don't want people to go to prison because at the end of the day, that's just going to lead to the same things occurring. And the other thing is like, America is still racist. And it will always be racist. The only way that America is no longer racist is like, I hate to say this, the feds can come for me, but if it's America doesn't exist, right? Like, you can't reform a cotton dress into a linen dress. You know what I mean? Like, it was made out of cotton.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.